In this episode, I'm once again joined by Tibetologist, author, and Tantric Buddhist Lama, Glenn Mullin. Glenn explains the 4 classes of Buddhist Tantra: Kriya, Charya, Yoga, and Anuttarayoga, including their history and development and what distinguishes them from each other in practice and view. Glenn reveals the structures of each level of Tantra, compares their creation and completion stage practices, and discusses the possible Persian origin of the Bön and Nyingma schools and their classification systems. Glenn also guides a walkthrough of the Kriya Tantra practice of Avalokiteshvara, using his own translation of the 3rd Dalai Lama's practice text to illuminate each step. So without further ado, Lama Glenn Mullin. Glenn Mullin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So it's been about 7 months since our last interview, and I know you've been up in the gas bay for most of the last year, in fact, working on your book on Nicholas Roerich and doing a lot of Zoom teaching. First of all, how's it been and what have you been up to?
Yeah, well, after my American tour, my annual sort of 25, 30 city US tour last year, in 2020, which went from mid-January until end of May. By, I would say, mid-April, travel began to shut down international travel. And I was supposed to lead a trip to Kailash in May, which we immediately postponed until this year, thinking perhaps the COVID will slow down. This year it didn't slow down, so that basically also fell apart. But at the end of that, I couldn't go back to Asia, my little apartment in Seoul, and couldn't lead the Kailash journey. And also every year in spring, I've been taking an acupuncture group to the Buddhist communities of Nepal, the north of Nepal, to do free medical clinics, and we had to cancel that. So I had to decide what to do. So I thought, for several years now, I've been wanting to come back to my birthplace, which is on the east coast of Canada, a little town called Gaspé, a Mi'kmaq Indian word. Mi'kmaq Indians from the Chickasaw Hills, as they're known, meaning the end of the earth or land's end. And I've been wanting to come back and spend a winter here for quite a few years. So last year in June, I thought, well, I'll come up and spend a few months here. And a few months became a few more months, and then COVID had a second wave and then a third wave. And now it's on its 4th wave. So there is some talk things might improve in the next month or two, but anyway, as a result of that, I came here and I thought, well, I'll do a writing retreat. I'll do a book on Nicholas Roerich, the great Russian-born New York artist who was the first Buddhist to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1929, I think it was. So I came here then and rented a little cabin in the forest. After a few months there, I found a very nice little apartment in a high school friend's home that is a rental, and it overlooks the sea. So I spent the winter here with waking up each morning with a beautiful view of the sea and snow in my driveway. And well, the book has come along slowly. Meanwhile, I do maybe, 6, 8, 10 webinars a week with different students and groups around the world. And also work on 1 or 2 other projects that sort of, you could say, have been on the back burner for some time.
Like what? Anything worth mentioning?
Well, main one I'm working on right now is, as I mentioned just a moment ago, for the last few years, I've been taking an acupuncture sort of naturopath healing group to Buddhist Nepal, the Buddhist regions of Nepal annually. And we brought along a professional filmmaker on the last run. So looking at making maybe a 45 or a 50-minute documentary film out of that, going through those dozens of hours of video footage and coming up with the best footage and a sort of an interesting storyline. Also, I have to look at other projects. I've got 2 or 3 books going into foreign languages, and that always takes a fair amount of work. And because the international book market has changed a lot in the last 20 years, you could say, partly because of internet and pirating and all that. Often foreign translations, they want to cut the length. Books that used to be very popular at 300 or 400 pages, now they like at 150 to 200 pages. Books that have been very popular at 200 pages, they now want it at 100 to 125 pages. So figuring how to edit down editions in that way is a little bit, every time that happens takes better part of a week or so to sort through and give advice to the translator on how to capture the essence of that book and still make it a substantial breakfast of champions.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, we've covered in the many episodes that we've recorded quite a lot of ground, and especially on the completion stage practices or dzogrim practices, specifically 6 yogas of Naropa and 6 yogas of Nyingma. Of course, we covered many other things also, but that was the main thrust, I think, of at least the first several episodes. And in this episode, I'd like to focus on the classifications of Tantra in the Tibetan Buddhist system, as well as discuss a bit more about the generation stage or khyerim practices. I'll be quoting from your book, The Heart of Chenrezig, Dalai Lama's on Tantra,
which earlier came out as a hardcover book with Snowline. So Shambhala brought that out as a paperback in that with a retitle.
That's right. And I strongly suggest people get this. It's a collection of translations of different Dalai Lama's writings on themes of Tantra with the translator's preamble, as it's called, your introduction to each of the texts. I think just reading those introductions is quite informative in itself. And then, of course, there's the text that you've translated as well. So in that book, you write, there are 4 classes of Tantra, and each class has various individual tantric systems within it. Each of these tantric systems is represented by a tantric deity, and also by its own mandala. In fact, each of the individual systems is a complete recipe for enlightenment, a complete way in and of itself. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what are the 4 classes of Tantra, what's their history in terms of their development, and what distinguishes them from each other in terms of practice and view.
Yeah, I think originally Buddha didn't talk about 4 classes of Tantra. Buddha just taught various Tantras to various disciples. And so when we say development, I prefer to follow the classical lineage interpretation rather than go the direction of Western scholarship, which learned about Buddhism in Sri Lanka and therefore saw anything non-Sri Lankan as a later development of Buddhism. So in the tradition, we say Buddha taught many, many tantras to various disciples. And usually these were taught as something that would be maintained in secret, if you will, or discreetly until the time of their usefulness came into focus. So according to prophecy, Buddhism will last 5,000 years. And one of the reasons for that 5,000-year sustaining power, if you will, is this manner in which Buddha sort of created little, should we call them time capsules? Sort of like little energy transmissions, each mailed, you could say, to a different date in the future, to be delivered on, blah, blah, blah. Like back in January, when you order flowers for your girlfriend's birthday in September, because you don't want to forget it when September comes. But meanwhile, the company has it on their computer for those 9 months, and then September, it gets delivered on time, even though you forgot you had ordered them. So the Buddhist attitude is something like that. Buddha taught many levels of teaching. Sometimes we classify those into three levels: outer, inner, secret, and the outer being basically the three higher trainings: Noble Eightfold Path, 12 links of dependent origination. The inner being the Mahayana, the Prajnaparamita, the Avatamsika, and the secret, the Tantric path. So Western scholarship generally tends to think of the first being early Buddhism or original Buddhism, and the other two later developments. Buddhist masters, lineage holders, great beings do not and have never had that particular opinion of things, that particular take, and they don't. I mean, we may have some lamas now educated in the West who are picking it up, but it's not there in any of the classical literature or classical transmissions. And so I always address these issues from the classical perspective, the lineage holder perspective, not from opinions of Western academics. Now, Buddha taught many hundreds of tantras. Sometimes in the text, we'll see tens of thousands mentioned. And so we don't really know how many, because Buddhists love to poetically embellish. But as time passed in India, if we take something like, say, the Tara Tantra, which is very, very popular with Tibetans, Mongolians, all of the Himalayan world, all the way up to the Altai Mountains and Siberia, that Buddha taught the Tara Tantra to a small group of disciples as something to be transmitted quietly until the times had ripened for their practice. Similarly, taught the, say, Avalokiteshvara, the Chenrezig Tantra, the Vajrapani Tantra, the Majushri Tantra, Amitayus. And then other very complex tantras like Guhya Samaja, Kala Chakra, Chakra Samvara, and so forth. And I don't know if there's any direct reference from root tantras. I've never heard of it and never seen it quoted in any tantric commentary saying, and then Buddha spoke this Kriya Tantra or this Charya Tantra, this Yoga Tantra, this Anuttarayoga Tantra. I think the classification into four happens quite late in Indian Buddhist history, late meaning 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, those kind of centuries. And they really came because the big Buddhist monasteries were always looking to sort of create a kind of a encyclopedia Buddhistica. They're always trying to sort of shelve things, so to speak, and sort of put Library of Congress code numbers on them. And so somewhere along the line, and we're not exactly sure when, there's debates amongst different Tibetan Buddhist scholars, but somewhere along the line, the Indian masters started to recognize four principal qualities, differences between the various dozens of tantras taught by the Buddha, transmitted through these small private lineages, if you will, discreetly transmitted. In those days, it's often said no more than 3 lineage holders, 3 disciples were allowed to hold those lineages at any one time until the prophesied public presentation, public dissemination perhaps, became signified by omen, initiated by mystical omen and dream. And of course, we see in Tibet, Guru Rinpoche sort of continues that with his terma or treasure text tradition. Many things that we say, Padmasambhava taught this, Padmasambhava taught that. And often it's a treasure that emerges 1,000 or more years later. So in this way, the various tantras came up. And then, there's later classifiers, people gathering the tantras into packages, if you will, started to classify into 4 categories. Now, at the time that happened, highest yoga tantra, Guhya Samaja, was very, very popular, as was Chakra Samvara. And so they put that classification in a kind of a highest yoga tantra secret code language, which doesn't mean a lot to your average listener in terms of meaning, although the symbolism, the metaphor is easy to understand. Why something is in one category and not another is not so easy to understand. So the classical metaphor is the Kriya Tantra is like a young man walking through the busy marketplace and seeing a young lady with whom he has a deep karmic, romantic connection. And there's kind of an exchange of glances. Their eyes touch as they pass in the market. And a great bliss and joy kind of roll over both of them. They both notice the spark, so to speak. And so the next time they sit up and they just keep walking. They don't take it any further. So Kriya Tantra practice is a bit like that in terms of the clarity and joy that it works with. You could say something like that, that is utilized in that yoga. And with Charya Tantra, it's a bit like, well, then next time they see each other, they remember that sort of flash, that connection. And so they stop and pause and they talk and they laugh a little bit together. Ha, 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 hoo, nice to see you again. Ha, 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 hoo, hoo, hoo. And that kind of joy and sense of harmony, if you will, or sense of closeness, integrity, the oneness of the universe, the basic goodness of being, hops up a notch. So Charya Tantra is talking about how you utilize that mental space yogically and in meditation. And then Yoga Tantra, again, they meet sometime later, and it goes beyond talking and laughing and maybe just touching hands, like innocently, like just experimentally, like, oh, ha, 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 touch a hand. And now they actually kiss and pet a little bit. And that's like Yoga Tantra. And then the metaphor says, so, well, in Yoga Tantra, we're working with that deeper sense of physical pleasure or joy, and that deeper sense of the basic, thrilling, wonderful quality of being. And then the 4th, Anuttara, highest Yoga Tantra, is like making love when they finally get past those first 3 steps and they make love. And at the point of the mutual explosion into the orgasmic state. So that the metaphor for the 4 classes of tantras is put in that kind of language. Now, this comes from Guhya Samaja. This is based on the way the kind of language used by the Guhya Samaja Tantra, the Chakrasamvara Tantra, both of which are known in Tibetan as Begyu, hidden meaning tantras. In other words, it talks in a kind of a secret code. So if you take a Kriya Tantra like Tara, Chenrezig, Majushri, and you look at it like, how is that like exchanging glances? Or a Charya Tantra, how is that like laughing and talking and touching hands? And the yoga, how is that like kissing? And highest yoga, how is that like making love? That's a hidden Tantra meaning. So that's another issue altogether. And we don't see a lot of discussion of that, I would say. If we put it another way, sometimes these 3 at the first end of things, the exchanging glances, talking and laughing and kissing, those are sometimes referred to as the Ogyu, the lower tantras, or the underneath. Og means below something. And the 4th level is called the Lamegyu, peerless or unrivaled, nothing above tantra. So sometimes they put in those 2 categories. And doing so is based, again, on the kind of language used in the Chakrasamvara and Guhya Samaja Tantras, the hidden meaning tantras, which are written in this kind of secret code language, with a lot of the code being sort of sex and violence, you could say, sex and violence. Based a code of sex and violence in the sense that our male energy tends to be violent. Men like, there's an expression, your average Scotsman is only at peace when he's at war. Oops, you're Scots. The average Irishman is only at peace when he's what? In Tantra, we say the male energy, and if you're a male or a female, doesn't matter, because you still have a mom and a dad, and grandmas and granddads and so on. Your male side is this aggressive side and the instinct to dominate and to use whatever is necessary to dominate. And of course, violence is one of the most direct methods, you could say. And the female is the deep instinct to nest, to make babies, to procreate, and to have peace and happiness and joy, so the kids don't get, orphaned at a young age or killed off at a young age. And myself as a man, from my male side, I'll have that instinct, and from the female side, I'll have that instinct. I'll have both sides going for me. So highest yoga tantra is largely transmitted through this kind of very sexually charged, if you will, male-female linguistic, and therefore is called hidden meaning, because what does it boil down to in actual practice? And this is always, of course, something in the oral transmission and in the practice, and as the way one learns it, master to student or hierophant to initiate. As in that passage which you read, so when Buddha taught a tantra, then a tantra has the name of a particular Buddha form, which is the main practice, such as Tara, Majushri, and so forth. It has a mandala, which is the object of meditation. It has the mantras associated with it. And another name for Tantra is Guhya Mantrayana, the path of secret mantras. It'll have an initiation ceremony in which it is transmitted from one generation to the next. And then it'll have an instruction on practice, which in the Ogyu, the lower tantras, are often just called Rinpa Tumpo, Rinpa Nipa, first stage, second stage. The first stage being a kind of a sadhana with a mandala and mantra practice. And the second stage being so in lower Tantra, that first stage is often called Sempe Nelch, or the yoga of signs or symbols. And in highest yoga Tantra, it's called the visualization stage, or creative imagination stage, khyerim in Tibetan. Sometimes we translate that as generation stage, because khepa just means to be born or to generate. What is it that is born? What is that? What generate? We generate an image of our already enlightened nature, something like that. In the lower tantras, that second stage is just called Sempe Nelch, or the yoga with no symbols, no signs. A simple kind of vipassana, Zen, Mahamudra, something like that. In fact, sometimes the second stage in Kriya is called Kriya Mahamudra, Charya Tantra, Charya Mahamudra, and so forth. That word is, that terminology is sometimes used. Highest Yoga Tantra, the first stage of the hidden tantras, is generating the mandala, and in particular, noticing how one's own ultimate nature is always clear light mind, formless clear light mind. Even when we're looking at a very busy scene, like say we're in the middle of a boxing match, like the Canelo Billy Joe Sanders boxing match that took place 2 weeks ago in Texas, in a crowd of 73,000 people, even though many states are under lockdown, boxing fans can step above such hysteria. Even in such a place, such a busy environment, two boxers in the middle of a ring, one punching at the other with full force, crowd of 73,000 people yelling continually through the whole thing, lights everywhere. Your coaches yelling instruction, and your trainers telling you do this and do that, and the referee saying, step back, step in, don't punch. Keeping all of that together, one has to come to that from the place of the utter clarity of one's own mind. So the first stage of generation stage is noticing how one's own essential nature, one's own essence is beyond all form, beyond time, beyond space, beyond any aspect, beyond aspectification. And the second, coming out of that into Sambhogakaya, that when one comes into the world of form with a sense of one's infinity nature, in highest Yoga Tantra, we say your clear light nature, which has these three qualities of bliss, physical, these three qualities of, great bliss, great radiance, and zero duality. Zero duality. And when one comes out of formlessness with those three qualities into a world of form, one experiences that form in a kind of a very joyful, radiant, clear way. So it's called Sambhogakaya, learning to experience the world of form on the basis of bliss, radiance, and unity, oneness, if you will. Non-duality in English being kind of confusing to people. Think, oh, no hot, no cold, no good, no bad, no difference between killing and saving a life, and so on. And thirdly, sometimes one gets in rough situations and there's very difficult encounters. So say, for instance, a boxer, Canelo versus the great British-Irish gypsy, Billy Joe Sanders. In the middle of the ring, they're both paused in the emptiness. And then they come out and they notice they've got 73,000 fans cheering them, and probably 10 million watching worldwide, all cheering them. And then they feel good. This is really wonderful. Isn't life grand? Here I am, being paid to just stand in this ring and get 10, 20, 30 million dollars just for smiling and looking handsome. That's kind of Sambhogakaya, if you will, the basic pleasure of being in the world of form. Then comes the Nirmanakaya immersion. Well, there's goods and bads, ups and downs, pleasures and pains, pleasant, unpleasant. How to maintain your clarity and the joy. And when you're at the high end, not to become inflated by your billions of dollars you've made or great accomplishment of winning the boxing match or whatever. And when you're on the low end, you just went bankrupt. Like, wasn't it the Irish banker who also owned an airline and had a mortgage business, and he became the richest man in England about 20 years ago. And then suddenly his real estate investments, he was insuring his own real estate investments. So when real estate went down, he was paying himself for his losses. So both went bankrupt. And he went from the richest man in Ireland to the poorest man in Ireland. So how do we hit rock bottom and still maintain those three qualities of joy, radiance, and a sense of harmony or goodness? So generation stage is really talking about how to do that. It's kind of a yoga of rehearsing that on our meditation mat, if you will. And then using mantra, meditation, focus, very particular techniques to be able to do that. So generation stages like that in highest yoga tantra. Then in completion stages, of course, it's the chandali or the tumo, the Buddhist kundalini, as I like to call it. So those four classes of tantra, each transmitted in its own lineage and with its own line of gurus going back to the Buddha, as we always say in the tradition. And when they're kept alive, they continue into the future. Each has to be maintained as a living tradition. And if a tradition ends, one lineage, it cannot be revived just through literature or just through academic knowledge. It has to be, it's called lung, which actually means breath. It has to be transmitted by the breath of a living lineage holder. And fortunately today, Tibet managed to receive most of these tantric lineages at the time of the Muslim invasions of India, when Buddhism in India was destroyed. And many Indian Buddhist masters, tantric masters, ran to the Himalayas, and in Tibetan Buddhist masters, Tibetans received them with great regalia and enthusiasm. And from that time until today, they've preserved many of those lineages, most of those lineages, I would say. Some also traveled across the Silk Road and came down into China, up to Mongolia, and went in other ways to other countries. But Tibet, being located to the immediate north of India, became the major recipient, we could say, of outer, inner, and secret Buddhism, of all three forms of Buddhism, because of its close proximity. And of course, from about 630 AD, so 1400 years ago or so, Tibet was declared itself to be officially an Indian Buddhist cultural satellite. Translations from Kashmiri or Khotanese or Tangut or Chinese or Mongolian were not allowed anymore in Tibet. They had to be translated from Indian Sanskrit. So as a result, Tibet became this great repository of what Dalai Lama likes to call Sanskrit Buddhism, but which we never see that said in any traditional Tibetan text, but it's a fair name for it. It's a reasonable name for it. But we could say really of outer, inner, and secret forms of Buddhism as they unfolded in India. And that's all about that.
Fascinating. Thank you. I'd ask you about some of those points, but for completion's sake, the classification that you've described and that I asked you about is characteristic of the new schools, as they say, the Sarma schools. And it seems the usual Nyingma classification is a little bit different. For the sake of completeness, could you perhaps summarize their classification system?
Right. Well, the Nyingma system isn't really different. It just takes those four and further subdivides. And we can always do that in any system. So when they talk about the 9 yanas, they divide them into 9. And so still we see Kriya, Charya, and Yoga Tantra there. And on top of Yoga, we see 2 more, Mahayoga. And so these are often in the new systems, because we could say when they came to Tibet, when Nyingma came to Tibet, Tibet was Bön. And so much of Nyingma doctrine is written in the language of the old Bunpo tradition, borrows from the old Bunpo tradition. And in the Bunpo tradition, the 9 ways of Bön was a very popular category. And so I think they divided into 9 because of that, but that's just a personal opinion. I couldn't document that exactly, but Snellgrove, great British Indologist, you could say, is of that opinion, and I tend to agree with it. There's no reason to stop at 4. It's just, one of the great Indian writers, and he came in India later than Padmasambhava, probably 8th century, I think, whereas Padmasambhava, 9th century, so 800s, whereas Padmasambhava is coming to Tibet. And now Padmasambhava, when he comes to Tibet, we often say he brought Buddhism to Tibet, but when he came to Tibet, Buddhism was already the national religion of Tibet when he came. So he didn't really bring Buddhism to Tibet. He brought his lineages of Tibet to a Tibet which already had been nationally, formally Buddhist for well over 100 years. And so we can say probably that classification into the 9 yanas started really from the days of the early translators, sort of to fit things into the Bunpo schemata, because the purpose, of course, of any translation into any language is to make that material meaningful to its readers. And so Snellgrove is of the opinion that the 9 ways of Bön may have acted as that inspiration for dividing into 9 in Tibet. So Shravaka Yana, Bodhisattva Yana, the 2 sort of standard sutra ways, that's very common in all ways. So when we say 4 classes of Tantra, the 9 categories aren't just of Tantra, but they're also of Buddhism as a whole. So Shravaka Yana and Bodhisattva Yana. So we could say those are outer and inner. Hinayana, Mahayana, if you want, if you're not afraid to use the word Hinayana as something not meaning a derogatory term for certain schools of Buddhism, used in the sense of Lamegyu and Ogyu, higher tantras and lower tantras. It's not a meaning, sort of the basic level of practice, you could say. And the Bodhisattva, the universal, the idea of Ik-yana, all paths, all roads lead to Rome. Everyone is going to enlightenment, even if they don't know it, even if they're totally kind of, say a New Guinea or an Amazonian headhunter at the moment. That's just part of their pilgrimage to enlightenment. Adolf Hitler was just on his way to enlightenment, just taking a little bit of a side distraction detour, you could say. So Nagarjuna's Ik-yana expression, one path in the sense that all beings are on the path to enlightenment, regardless of where they are at that particular time in that particular incarnation. And then dividing the 4 classes of Tantra into 7 by taking highest yoga tantra, and sometimes we see it said that, you know, the what is it, Mahayoga? What's the other Sanskrit name?
Anu Yoga and Ati Yoga.
Anu, yeah, Anati. Yeah, I forgot Anu. I once had a very wonderful Nepali lady friend by the name of Anu. We had a bitter separation. That might be why I couldn't remember Anu Yoga. But anyway, we see it said in some commentaries that Mahayoga, Ana Yoga, these are like the male divisions of Tantra into male Tantras and female Tantras in the later Indian classifiers, you could say. That the earlier classification really is coming from roughly 630, 650 through the 700s. That was kind of a way of talking about the totality of Buddhism coming to Tibet in those periods. And then Ati Yoga really being a kind of a separation of Buddhism into a kind of a Mahamudra side, you could say, beyond specifics, sort of a formless sort of Buddhism that can be fit into any of the other 8 quite conveniently without having to change whatsoever. So sometimes, you know, when we see it read that someone is a Dzogchen teacher, Ati there being, Dzogchen being not a very literal translation of Ati, but someone's a Dzogchen teacher, it doesn't really mean they're teaching the 9th yana. Usually, often in different schools of Buddhism, we talk about Tawa Chupagamba, view, meditation, and activity, but you could say general practice, something like that. So Tawa there means a kind of an attitude or a way of looking, a kind of a philosophical stance. So some people translate Tawa as philosophy. So when we say Ati Yoga, there's Dzogchen. And sometimes we'll say Dzogchen is the highest teaching of the Buddha. We don't see that said in any new school of Buddhism. Basically because they don't use that classification. So for instance, in Dalai Lama school, we say the highest teaching of Buddhism, and Marpa Lotsuwa and the Kargyupa say highest teaching of the Buddha is the clear light teaching of the Guhya Samaja Tantra. But if we were to divide Guhya Samaja, Chakra Samvara, and the clear light teaching into 3 yanas, then we would say one is Mahayoga, one is Anu Yoga, and one is Ati Yoga. That Guhya Samaja would be Mahayoga, and Chakra Samvara would be Anu Yoga. And the clear light would be Ati Yoga. So the division into 9 yanas in no way has nothing in it which is not in the 4 classes of Tantra, because when we say 4 other than the Shravaka and Bodhisattva yana, but in all highest yoga tantras, in all the new tantras, the Sarma tantras, they make the very strong emphasis that to practice Tantra at all, you have to have refuge, bodhicitta, 3 higher trainings from the Shravaka yana or Hinayana, and you must have the Tabtam Shera, Upaya, and Prajna teaching from the Mahayana. So if we look at all the new schools, they equally have 9 yanas. They just don't use that way of discussion. Now, if we ask as other possibilities for why that is so, the new tantras almost exclusively come from central India. You know, Bodh Gaya is very important, Odantapuri, Vikramashila. And then the Mahasiddhas, most of those Mahasiddhas being Central Indian. In other words, Nepal, Bengal, Orissa, very, very important areas. So those areas are the regions that essentially speak about Hinayana, Mahayana, outer, inner, and secret, and the secret being the 4 classes of Tantras. Now, if we look at Nyingma and their later codification, we Canadians say codification, but Americans say codification, like as in the word codfishification, codification. Their codification, of course, Bunpo comes from Persia. You know, this is stated by the Bunpos themselves. Tumpa Sherab came from, when he came to Tibet and brought Bön to Tibet, he came from Tazig, which is the old name for the Persian Empire. And so we can say that Bunpo and Nyingma are more influenced in the way of discussing and codifying the Buddhist lineages. And they're more connected to the codifications that were being used, and we could say Afghanistan, Gilgit, maybe Khotan, and what generally we refer to as the East Persian Empire, when the East Persian Empire was all still quite strongly Buddhist. Bamiyan is kind of an example, right? Everyone knows of it because of the Taliban using artillery to blow up some of the Buddhist statues. So Nyingma and Bunpo both have very strong influences from those areas. And in fact, you know, the old Bunpo stronghold prior to Songtsen Gampo was the Shangshung north of Mount Kailash. So if we go back to Snellgrove, he thinks that much of what we think of as Bön today was in fact Buddhist, coming from pre-Songtsen Gampo times, coming in from Afghanistan, northwest Pakistan, and eastern Iran in today's world, today's political boundaries. And so those ninefold classification was there. Now, also, if we look in India, we do see 9 categories of the doctrine, which was a popular way of discussing, you know, everything taught by the Buddha, putting them in 9 ways, but that doesn't really involve so much the tantras. It's more to do with the literary transmission, the Lung Bechu rather than the Tok Bechu. Although I think one of those is Upadesha, meaning sort of oral transmissions. Yeah, so, you know, there is nothing in all schools of Tibetan Buddhism, including Bön, we can say are 99% the same in those, in the general structure of things. 99% of statistics are made up on the spot, and I just made up that statistic. But they're at least 95% the same. And the 5% difference, of course, in Bunpo, they use some mandalas which look different than the Tibetan ones, and their translations come from the Eastern Persian Empire rather than the Sanskrit versions from you know, Bengal and so forth. So we see linguistic differences and structural differences, some form differences, because the visualizations in generation stage are, of course, mainly oral transmission from visions of particular teachers. The essence is taking the 3 kayas as the path, kusam lamkir, but the specifics, any lineage master in history can change specifics to suit his or her fancy, because it's just a symbol of a process. And so the only concern a teacher has is the enlightenment of his or her students. So he or she might adapt any specific mandala, visual, if you will, detail, to suit whatever that lineage master thinks is the most appropriate. Completion stage in all the different tantras is pretty much the same, with, of course, difference in specific details.
That's fascinating. And I'd like to ask you a bit about the modifications and customizations a little later. But first of all, in your preamble, translator's preamble, the introduction to your translation of the third Dalai Lama's Tantric Yogas of the Bodhisattva of Compassion, you write, the third Dalai Lama divides the training into 7 stages. The preliminaries, the yoga with symbols, the yoga without symbols, the yoga between sessions, the yoga of sleep, the yoga for consciousness transference, the yoga for attaining enlightenment in the bardo. The second and third of these, you continue, the yoga with symbols and the yoga without symbols are the Kriya Yoga and Charya versions of what the fourth class of Tantra calls the generation and completion stage yogas. And thus, together with the 4, could be considered the main body of the training. The 5th, 6th, and 7th could also be called supplementary or branch trainings. So I'm curious, what are the key differences, if there are any, between the khyerim stages of the 4 classes of Tantra, and how do the Kriya, Charya, and Yoga Tantra versions of the dzogrim compare to the Anuttarayoga versions?
The Kriya Charya Tantra are both characterized by a process very different than highest Yoga Tantra. Highest Yoga Tantra, as I mentioned, Kusum Lamkir, taking 3 occasions as 3 kayas, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, which I very skillfully wove into a promotion of the Canelo Billy Joe Saunders boxing match. Kriya Tantra doesn't follow that format in a linguistic way or in a formal way. Rather, the generation stage there is often known as Hlatruk, excuse me. 6 and 9 look almost the same, except one's upside down in English, and Tibetan look different. So the six sacred natures, you could say, the 6 deities, the 6 gods, the 6 enlightenments, Hla there, Deva, actually meaning something like our sacred nature. So the question is the same, right? How do we stay in touch with our sacred nature as we go about our general life as bank manager, taxi driver, carpenter, vegetable salesman, houseboat dweller in a luxury canal in England? How do we maintain, through all the highs and lows that life throws upon us, a sense of our sacred nature, our spiritual essence, while encountering all of the vicissitudes, girlfriends coming and going, boyfriends coming and going, husbands and wives divorces, and kids coming and going, and parents and friends living and dying, and all of these sort of things. So in the highest Yoga Tantra, there's Kusum Lamkir, taking 3 occasions as 3 kayas is, you could say, the actual yoga. And we use mantra to kind of reinforce that as a kind of a tool for maintaining that focus. Now in Kriya Charya Tantra, and I don't like to discuss Yoga Tantra here because I'm not so comfortable with Yoga Tantra being separated from highest Yoga Tantra. I think only Indian classifier and the Tibetans who follow Indian classifiers without contemplating it very deeply will have much of a sense of that. But anyway, for me, we could quite easily say 3 classes of Tantra. That's why when you said 3 classes, I thought, oh, Steve is slipping into a visionary state. He's reading my mind. So Kriya Tantra, both of what they call Hlatruk, the 6 sacred natures. When we do our practice, the first thing we do is go and we dissolve the whole universe into light, and then light into our body, and then the body into our heart chakra, and our heart chakra into light. And this is known as the ultimate deity, Dundampe La, the ultimate God, the ultimate Buddha. In other words, this is our sort of equivalent and highest yoga tantra to taking clear light of death, clear light of sleep, or clear light of orgasmic experience, if you will, as Dharmakaya, as a pointer to the nature of our formless Buddha nature, our Dharmakaya mind, our already Buddha quality, already a Buddha quality. So we do that more complexedly in highest yoga tantra and in yoga tantra. In Kriya Tantra, we just do it as a simple zoom, light, zoom, light, zoom, light, zoom, light. So we just kind of do in that way. And then we rest in that as a kind of an emptiness meditation or a Mahamudra meditation. Now, for instance, in Nyingma or Bön, doing that practice, this is kind of your time. You might do dzogchen, for instance, or if you're a sarma, you might, a new school person, meaning any non-Nyingma school, then you might do Mahamudra. And if you do it specifically in the Kriya Tantra, you do it as Kriya Mahamudra, which is simply resting the mind in the cell tongue, the radiance and the formlessness. And so that term is used very much in Kriya Mahamudra and in this practice of the 6 sacred natures. Then we come out of that sacred nature as a sound. In other words, when you sit in the sacred nature of clear light, if we were to combine this, say, with highest yoga tantra, taking Sambhogakaya as the path, when you sit in clear light of moment of death being like Dharmakaya, so after you achieve, at the moment of enlightenment, a person, their mind falls into infinite Dharmakaya, like a drop of water in the ocean, becoming one with the ocean. You lose all sense of any form momentarily. And then you saw, wow, it's so nice to be infinite. A drop in the ocean, a drop no more. But eventually, your bodhisattva precept to be of benefit to all beings stirs a kind. So, in other words, the power of compassion comes in, you could say, and says, hey, wow, here I am in Dharmakaya, but what about that Guru Viking guy, Steve James? He's on a 10th level bodhisattva, but he still has at least a millimeter to enlightenment. And so in highest yoga tantra, you emanate out as Sambhogakaya, then as Nirmanakaya. But in Kriya, we go through 6 stages to go from, we could say from Arupakaya to Rupakaya, from formless to fully form, something like that, the formless realm to the realm of enlightenment form. And the first of that is the stirring of energy, which resonates with a sound. Pum, ha, usually like that. And pum being kind of, you could say, our male aggressive side of bodhicitta, what's known in Sutra Yana as sort of conventional bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta, sometimes as easily deceived bodhicitta, because it's easily falls under the spell of duality. And being ultimate bodhicitta, kind of mixing in emptiness with compassion, compassion with a sense of nothing is what it appears. And this comes out and manifests as a symbol in chakra, and in Avalokiteshvara's case, this is usually a lotus, which is a symbol of compassion, wisdom. Of Chenrezig, like a lotus grows in mud, but is not stained by the mud. If it were a Kriya Tantra in the Vajra family, Rather than lotus, it might be a vajra. And in the chakra family, it might be, say, a wheel, an 8-spoked wheel. And so this is a little bit like going in the direction of taking evolution, evolving nature, bardo, dreams, and so forth as Sambhogakaya. Exiting pure formlessness into the world of form in a kind of a symbolic form. And often that symbol will then be marked by a letter on top of the lotus. If it's Tara, will be a syllable tum. If it's Amitayus, will be a red hri. If it's Chenrezig, a white hri, and so on. And so that's known as the syllable sacred nature. What is my sacred nature? Sound-wise, if I go hri, or tum, or in Vajra family, often as hung, it sort of touches or resonates some kind of very subtle quality in the depth of our soul. I was just watching a neurological conference on the mysterious power of sound over water. There's a research, I think, being done in a university in, if I'm not, either in Lancashire, I think it's in Lancashire, but anyway, one of the British universities. If you take a glass of water and put it on top of a certain kind of a sound speaker and you put sound in it, the molecules in the water actually change and make form. And you can put some kind of very light grains of sand-like material on top of a skin that will vibrate, and that sound will cause these to come out in very particular mandala-like patterns. I was very impressed by this, although the actual thing was on, how shamanic traditions in ancient societies use sound and psychedelics to transform the relationship between mind and matter. And that was a kind of a neurological look at it. And but the physiology of sound and the neurological impact of all of the kind of situation. So when we go hung or he, utara tum, now we may just be visualizing it, but when you visualize it, it's as though you're supposed to be in your mind, not just seeing the form, but the thing the tum, which you are visualizing, or the hri, is resonating with that sound. So it's a little bit like with the water when you go tum. And it was very amazing watching illustrations of this in an actual scientific library. These total mandala shapes appeared on top of the skin, if you will, holding the grains of sand, and often in 5 shapes, very much like many Buddhist mandalas have a circle at the center and the circle in each of the direction. This happened with many of them. And the water, again, looked very much like a mandala shapes emerging in the water. I was actually talking about physiologically, the sound also compresses water molecules. In other words, the reason why the water takes a different shape isn't just that it's shaking, but the actual molecules are being compressed. Their shape is being changed temporarily by the sound. So the third level, when we go tum or hri, and there's nothing else in the universe, just the tum or the hri. And again, this is touching our sacred nature. This is our third plot. This is our third godliness, if you will, if we want to translate La, Deva, as God, or our third dimension or frequency of our enlightenment, natural enlightenment nature. And so in this way we go. I won't bore people by going through all 6 levels, because then it becomes too long. And then you would have to make huge offerings to me, donations, for my kindness in giving such a transmission. But essentially, then this Hri sends out lights, and or the Tam or the Hung or whatever, D, if it's Majushri, sends out lights. And well, often the translations will say, make offerings to all the Buddhas. But actually the word chupa, puja in Sanskrit, means delight. Delight all Buddhas, make all Buddhas happy. In other words, how do we really touch the natural enlightenment quality of the universe? Is by essentially resonating with that natural enlightenment quality, isn't it? It's a little bit like when an opera singer sings in one place, a glass in another part of the room can suddenly go pop. Sort of the resonance created by this universal joy or something like that. The light goes out and touches all the Buddhas, and the delight just sort of creates this transformation. And it comes back to us in a great wave of joy, a great wave of sense of goodness, a sense of wonder of being, and so forth. And we send out another wave of light, and we touch all living beings. And touching all living beings, it sort of brushes them with this joy. So it sweeps over the Sudan. So just for a moment, those pirates out, kidnapping oil tankers feel a little more enlightened. And, the Israelis and the Palestinians shooting at one another across the fence of the Gaza division strip. Just for a moment, they relax and feel a little more enlightened. And everything from bugs to 10th level bodhisattvas feels just for a moment a kind of a cool breeze of enlightenment. I think it's also important when we do that, it's our compassionate connectivity with all beings, regardless of their goodness, badness, or indifference, their seeming likability, their seeming unlikability, or a seeming can be overlooked quality. And then we transform and become the form of the deity, the form of the God, the form of the Buddha. So our body becomes like Chenrezig, like Tara, looks like, but it's kind of like still a little bit of an empty shell. So we have to really empower it. And then from the Hri at our heart, or from whatever Hung or Di or Tum, again we send out lights, and it brings back all the enlightened forces, past, present, and future of the 10 directions. And Zao Hum Bam Ho. And they all flow through us and into us. And we become completely unified with the natural enlightenment quality of the entire universe. It's like me and the tree. We get along. Me and the iceberg floating down the St. Lawrence River. Me and that lobster fisherman down on the beach below me. We're okay. The sacred nature flows with full force. And sometimes we'll also send out lights again, bring back all the power deities, because, well, yeah, I feel one with that tree and connected with those clouds, but I still feel a little bit on the feeble side, a little wimpy, a little bit of a wimp still left in me. So we call back and Om Abhishikata Samya Shriya Ahung, and all the deities of power empowering or of power come and pour liquids, and they flow into my body. And just every cell of my body becomes activated with this pure enlightenment power. And it surges and surges and surges and overflows. And if a Chenrezig, then the overflow is so big that, like milk pouring out of a bottle when you boil it or something, it just overflows and forms into a Rigidakpo in Tibetan Rigdak, Lord of the family. So Amitayus or Tara transforms into Amitabha Buddha. So now my 6 qualities of enlightenment, I turn to my heart, the Ri, Om Mani Padme Hum, and I do that Om Mani Padme Hum mantra practice in particular ways as given in the oral transmission, which I will not say here because it is oral and this will be a recording. Ha, 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 ha. But with all Kriya Tantras, they're practiced in a very similar way. And therefore, when you understand one, you understand all. Therefore, we have certain kinds of them gathered into whole collections, like the Circa Gyatso and Kilkor Gyatso, and I guess those two being, Kilkor Gyatso being one of the very big ones, Rinchen Gyatso. Sometimes they're called Gyatso, sometimes they're called Gyatso, but anyway, Gyatso. The ocean of them, or the hundreds of them, like that. And the format is much the same in each. The enlightenment quality in each different Tantra and Kriya is a little bit different. With Chenrezig, the emphasis is on cultivating compassion. With Majushri, on cultivating or bringing out the cream of one's natural wisdom nature out of the milk of one's being, you could say. And with Tara, bringing out one's liberating and liberated energies. And Amitayus, one's natural healthfulness, wellness, and healing quality. Wherever you go, people can feel that healing quality. And where you merely look at someone and go, Mamarani, Zindaya Soha. And suddenly they go, oh my God, did I just take an overdose of vitamins? So in that way, the 6 deities of the first stage. Then at the end of the practice, everything goes back to emptiness. And we finish with, again, a Kriya Mahamudra practice. So all the mandala, everything dissolves into light, into me, and me as the deity, into the Hri at my heart, or whatever. And that itself dissolves into cell tongue, the radiant, infinite, the infinite radiance. But literally emptiness, radiant emptiness, but empty of what? Empty of finiteness, empty of aspectness, empty of a specific form, empty of specificity, something like that. Now, the completion stage is a kind of a specialized Kriya Mahamudra or Charya Mahamudra. We could say something like that. It's a kind of a specialized Mahamudra. So only in yoga and highest yoga tantra do we see Kundalini being introduced, or Chandali, Tumo being introduced. Now, Snellgrove, who made a wonderful translation of one of the 2 main yoga tantras, points out that he doesn't like the fact that it's not given a highest yoga tantra qualification. And he'd like to argue with that Indian scholar who in the 8th century said it as a separate tantra, because there's almost everything in it that you would find in a highest yoga tantra. Tibetans prefer to say, following the Indian system, like to say, it's a difference between kissing and stroking and full penetration and orgasm. The difference is that big. They put it like that, but Snellgrove says, I don't get it. And I must admit, I haven't studied the yoga tantras in any great depth. So I'm not really qualified to comment one way or the other, but often these initiations are given in a kind of a general way as a blessing. And so over the years, someone like me who was older than the hills has received hundreds and hundreds of empowerments. But in terms of practices, usually we will practice what our root gurus or our heart teachers suggest, our heart lamas suggest, and what feels best for us. So my own favorite practices have always been Yamantaka. From the beginning, I got that from Kyabji Ling Dorje Chang back in Christmas of 1972 or early January 1973, between the empowerment and the next year, Chakra Samvara from Kyabji Trishang Dorje Chang, the Dalai Lama's two great gurus. Others like Chenrezig, I got that from Kala Rinpoche first, the former great Karma Kargyu Lama, and his incarnation often referred to as head of modern day Shengpa Kargyu. And of course, I also received many times from Dalai Lama, Amitayus. It's one of my favorites. I first received that from Sakya Trizin Rinpoche, head of Sakya school, but also received from many other lamas, including Gyalwar Rinpoche, Dalai Lama, and so forth. So in terms of the division between Yoga Tantra, highest Yoga Tantra, because I haven't done much practice of Yoga Tantra other than the blessing transmission, then I don't really comment on whether Snell Grove is right or wrong, but I do like the difference between smooching and petting, the high school approach, to the more mature making love approach. I kind of like that metaphor in terms of my ability to clarify the meaning of those hidden words. No, we'll leave that out. Only will I speak those words to the highest bidder. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Glenn. That was fantastic. Fabulous. That Kriya Yoga exposition. I'm aware of the time, and I'm wondering about your time. I have actually 3.5 more questions, which could be an episode in themselves as a follow-up, I think. So why don't we do it as a two-parter?
As you wish. Just before ending, I'll just say a few things on those 7 categories that he uses, but just so page 83. I'll go to page 83 on it and just look at what those, because he divides the 6 yoga, he divides the Chenrezig Kriya Tantra into those 7. There we are, yeah. Okay, I should say that with the Chenrezig and my little text on the Chenrezig practice as presented in the Dalai Lama's on Tantra. What is it? What is the new title?
From the Heart of Chenrezig.
From the Heart of Chenrezig, yeah. As is pointed out in that, and as there's 2 main Chenrezig lineages popular in Tibet. One is the 1,000-armed 11 head form, which comes from the female mystic Gelongma Pelmo, as she's often known, and which is the basis of the 16-day fasting practice, which is done in Sagadawa. So many people throughout Central Asia for the last week and for the first 16 days of this 4th month, the Sagadawa month, one day they have 1 meal before noon and drink a ton of liquid during the day. And the next day they have 0 food and 0 liquid. And the 7th Dalai Lama made that a national holiday for those wanting to take it. So anyone who wanted to do the Nyungne, their bosses couldn't say, you have to go to work. So he really promoted it as a national practice. And that made every monastery in Tibet start doing it. So every time, for instance, I go to Chimpuk, the Guru Rinpoche caves behind Samye Monastery, all of the nuns in retreat at the top of that mountain, there's always 25 or 50 of them doing that practice. And most monasteries and temples and nunneries and so on throughout Central Asia do that Gelongma Palmo, Bhikshuni Shri transmission in connection with the fasting practice. And the other is known as the transmission of the Mahasiddhas. So the transmission of the Mahasiddhas, the most popular in Tibet is Chimpupa, the Mahasiddha, the tailor. And he combines Kriya Tantra with highest Yoga Tantra. And this became quite popular in later day India as a way for people to sort of pack practices into a session. So you've got a Chenrezig initiation, you've got a Chakra Samvara initiation. How do you do both of those in one session for ease of practice? So some of these fusion practices, you could say, emerged. It's a little bit like going to England, where you go to a pub and they'll have a fusion curry. In a British style, overcooked veggies with a nice big chunk of beef, with the Indian style of little chunks of beef and overcooked veggies with a bunch of curry powder thrown in and a bunch of liquid and boil it for. So they had these kind of fusion practices. And this one in particular that's in that book combines that quite a bit with the Chakra Samvara lineage, like coming through the same master. But when it's written about in Tibetan, they only ever mention the reference and say, get it from the oral tradition. So it was not the tradition to elucidate it. So just to go through what those 7 are.
Which Chakra Samvara lineage is that?
Well, the name of this particular Mahasiddha is Chimpupa.
Oh.
Mahasiddha tailor, but known by his profession. He achieved enlightenment sewing. I could use him right now. One of my shirts needs some sewing. So preliminaries is always there. Get the right initiations and so on, and receive the correct teachings and practices. So that's always there with every tantric lineage. Preliminaries, some texts will also say to have, done the outer and inner, the Hinayana, Mahayana. But here he just makes a short. Then yoga with symbols, which he does in a fair amount of depth with the visualization. Yoga without symbols. So often, like in 6 yogas of Naropa, that would be, you could say, like illusory body and clear light yogas. That which is in the 6 yogas of Naropa or 6 yogas of Nyingma. Those are the 2 actual enlightenment methods. In the 6 yogas, Tumo is the kind of the basis for exploring illusory body yoga and clear light yoga. So here you could say these are the Kriya Yoga equivalents in the language. Yoga between sessions, everyone has that. And sometimes we translate that as between sessions, but in Tibetan it's Jetob. During your meditation session, if you're doing that sadhana, you're supposed to connect with your 6 sacred natures. And when you finish, you go back into emptiness, and then you come out as Chenrezig and you go about your life. So Jetob means after getting it. In other words, during your meditation session, you gained a certain kind of power or strength or clarity or feeling or perspective or something like that. So maintaining that between sessions. So for instance, when we're doing dream yoga training during meditation sessions in 6 yogas, we'll stimulate whichever of the chakras is indicated by our progress. And between sessions, walking around, we'll go, this is a dream, but everything we see. So when we're sleeping and we dream, we'll say, hey, this is a dream. We'll wake up in our dreams like that. So, or if you're doing emptiness, during emptiness in the Lojong, it says, meditate on all phenomena as dreams and emptiness of mind and emptiness of emptiness, and then just rest in the kunshi, the foundation, rest the mind in emptiness. And between sessions, be like an illusory child. In other words, after you have a sense of emptiness from your practice and what emptiness and illusory appearance, between sessions, how to carry what you got in the chetab. So we call between sessions sometimes in translation for clarity, because if we say after you got it, people may not get the meaning, right? And then yoga of sleep is there in every tantra, every practice. How to go to sleep nicely is there in every practice. So if you're practicing in Hinayana, Mahayana, there'll be some suggestions for how to prepare for sleep at night. So here, of course, they look at a method which is a little bit drawing from the Chakrasamvara system of the white and red drops and bringing them together in particular ways, right? Mm-hmm. And the sixth, the yoga of consciousness transference, how to die consciously, preparing for conscious death. And so again, in the Mahasiddha Chimbupa's lineage, this is, again, bringing Poa a little bit from the Chakrasamvara, sort of 6 yogas tradition, if you will, but sort of mixing this back into a Kriya context. And Bardo Yoga. So again, all highest yoga tantras, clear light of death is in the sadhana as Dharmakaya, taking the Bardo as Sambhogakaya, and taking rebirth as Nirmanakaya. In completion stage becomes a method for enlightenment in this lifetime. And if we don't achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, at the time of death, either project your mind out of your body bypassing the Bardo as in Poa, or enter the dangerous Bardo and try to achieve enlightenment in the Bardo, as is the sort of the essence, the substance of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is sort of written for people who think they can do that. So many Tibetan tantras are sort of, we can talk about those 6 or 7 sort of kind of different aspects of the practice. But I just wanted to add that at the end, that those kind of ways of speaking of practice, generation and completion stage, and what to do between sessions, we could say these 3 are how you achieve enlightenment in this lifetime. Also, sleep and dream we could put into achieving enlightenment in this lifetime. Then Poa, Bardo, bye-bye, cruel world. Better luck next time. Okay, we finished there. Gawa di yurida Chenrezig wan trukyone draw chicken malopati sala gobar show. Bye-bye.
And Mullin, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.